CDP, I understand. So just so that you know that, and you know what is going to happen to the recording of the event. So yeah, we opened a few questions. We opened a few tracks that could be followed before the break. And joining me for this panel, we have more points of view, but also maybe more reactions to some of the suggestions and proposals that were made earlier on. I will, after the first couple of questions to the panelists, I will open the floor to the audience for questions on that first part, and then we'll pick up and continue with questions. We're going to try and make this as lively as possible, so do prepare your questions. And to the panelists, I'd like to invite you also to react to one another or comment maybe as we go, so that we can also have some sort of conversation as opposed to a series of questions from one to the other. So joining me for this panel, I have next to me Katrien Heren, who's the Director for Environment and Sustainability at FoodDrinkEurope. Next to her, you already know Jerome, who's presented earlier on, and he's the Director of the TAPP Coalition. Next to Jerome is Bert Oerlings, who's the Director for Public Affairs at the Vion Food Group. And at the end of our table is Long Lam, who's a Senior Consultant at Trinomics, and that's a consultancy specialized in energy, environment, and climate change advisory work. So welcome to all four of you. And as I said, we've had already quite a few proposals in the presentations before, but I'd like now to hear your reactions, your views. And I'd like to start with the same question to all four of you, to know what you think is the best instrument, or the instrument that is best adapted to meet the climate change targets that have been set for 2030 or 2040, depending on the specifics. And maybe I'll start with Long, because Torsten mentioned just before the break, he mentioned a report that you have published, and I think it could be interesting to have your view from that angle.
Okay, oh, when it's green, it's on. Thank you. Yes. No, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for having me here. I think I know some of the faces of you in the crowd, and some of the faces are new. That's partly because, I was indeed leading the study that was published in November 2023 for Valeria and her colleagues on, let's say, a potential exploratory study on pricing greenhouse gas emissions in the agriculture sector, as well as ways to link rewards of carbon removals to such emissions trading system. And at the moment we're working on a semi-follow-up, I would say, because we're also looking at broader climate incentives for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the agri-food value chain. And so throughout all these studies, I would say that I have a background in carbon pricing, emissions trading, and what I always say is that carbon pricing is a tool. It's a means to an end. It's not pricing, which is not the goal, but to achieve an objective. And the problem, or at least the curiosity with carbon pricing, is that it is never really always the best instrument, but almost always the second best. As in, if you know exactly what you want and what you want to achieve, then you don't necessarily need carbon pricing, because as some of the speakers also said, it's a policy instrument of choice, of choosing, of allowing companies to choose how to reduce their emissions. But that also means that in a complex policy landscape, you need, of course, carbon pricing. I think it is a powerful tool, but you also need other types of policies. So to answer the question of what kind of climate policy instrument is the best, I would say a package of policy instruments, of which carbon pricing can be one very powerful tool, be part of this, but it should be accompanied with other policy instruments, clever design measures to also especially reduce the impacts on adverse or adverse impacts on households, on low-income households, on consumers, as well as to safeguard the competitiveness of businesses.
Thank you. Catherine, in your view, what's the best solution? I mean, Long mentioned a mix, so that's yet another solution. So what's yours?
Thank you very much, Florence. Yes, and good afternoon, everybody. I would actually like to continue in Lang's proposition, so broadening up the spectrum a bit. If should it be an Agri-ETS or what kind of policy tool would we need? Maybe to get back also to where we come from. So Food Drink Europe, we are representing the food and drink industry, which is like a large industry, with very various players. And we closely work with farmers. We heard some examples earlier from Bart on projects on regenerative agriculture. There are lots more of examples out there. So I would like to look a bit more broader on what we need to do to decarbonize. We are really committed to go there, to go this way. And maybe just also to put it a bit in context in terms of numbers, what volumes are we talking about? In 2020, agri-food, the whole industry as a whole, so not only agriculture, but across the value chain, was responsible for 31% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the EU. And 73% of these emissions in agriculture, only 12% in our manufacturing part overall, which means that when we want to reduce along the supply chains, we need to look beyond. So downstream and upstream in order to really work collaboratively together across the supply chain and to facilitate the swift transition towards net zero. So that's why I would like to also go a long way a bit about having a mix of very different policy measures. Some of them are already in place, some need to be much more strengthened, that address the following issues. So we just conducted a study with Anthesis, a consultant, and there are Mary and Giacomo in the room representing them. It's still in the final phases of drafting, so it's interim results at the moment, looking at our net zero pathway overall, and where we found the greenhouse gas emission hotspots in areas that were already mentioned earlier today: energy and fuel use in the manufacturing part, energy and fuel use on the farms, land use change, of course, a big element, enteric fermentation, manure management, and fertilizer, both production and application. So across all these sectors, we were then also looking, our consultant and thesis, the team was looking then at the solutions. So of course there are solutions for all of these. It links to renewable energy applications, to better grids on the farmland, but also in general, also better systems on using, let's say, for example, combining different problems, making them to solutions, like using manure and creating biogas, and at the same time you can produce even fertilizer with phosphorus. So, optimizing and reducing emissions across all these different fields. So this is why one tool alone will not be able to address this from our view. So we have like 7 major asks on policy recommendations or requests to the policy level. First of all, it would need to start with a holistic and coherent food strategy. So food and drink strategy. Quite often our sector is either covered or not covered in the industry, and then in the agriculture where it's about farmers. So our industry as a whole, as an impulse that gives inspiration across the supply chain, as Bart pointed out earlier, could be quite useful in terms of having a holistic strategy. And then incentives. So we heard about the carrot and the sticks, but really also financial incentives that drive the transition to sustainable food systems on different ways. Common agricultural policy, there could potentially be more measures devoted to climate action that links the payment to these. There's the decarbonization accelerator coming along with the Clean Industrial Deal. Are there incentives also for the food and drink industry and processing? So all of these should be really looked at holistically. Access to renewable energy, both for the manufacturing and also at the farming level. And then number 4 would be enabling innovative decarbonization technologies. We heard a lot about some innovations that are still in the first stages, but some are already more involved, like for enteric fermentation, adding some specific feeding elements, or, there are lots of innovations out there that could improve the fertilizer application and also the fertilizer production, using more renewables. Number 5 would be better regulation and sustainability benchmarking. I think sustainability benchmarking was mentioned earlier also. So that's very interesting in terms of having data and having comparable data across Europe, across different farms, across the companies. And we hope that it would also help farmers, so help both farmers and the food processing industries along. Then effective and simplified due diligence, of course, a lot of talking is about reduced deforestation, so this would be about the imported emissions that we kind of get in. So making this realistic, with a realistic time frame, feasible for companies to follow up on, but also provide certainty to the sector. And finally, help consumer engagement. So this is a bit more broader, because we don't see that only one single tool that can solve the whole problem at once.
Thank you, Katrien. Bert, from your angle, is that also is a mix the best approach? And if so, what mix?
I think we are in Brussels, and then we are also obliged to speak to our policymakers. What do we need to get things fixed? And I also use the word of Matthew, fixed, get things fixed. Because there is already a lot of new legislation out, which is in the status of being implemented within the current years. The only thing I see now happening is that without awaiting what the effect is of the current new legislation already, we all speak about new legislation and new rules and all that kind of thing. So we get a little bit nervous about this. Well, on the other hand, we need some more and some better taxonomy, like the previous speaker spoke about. We are working on the CSRD. Big companies are implementing the CSRD. They are asking for real data. And this is moving the whole supply chain. And that's great. But what I don't hear from Brussels, and what is totally missing in the member states, is who is supervising the implementation of CSRD? Who's doing that? Even it's not on the local political agenda. So no, the big four or the others, the auditors, they just do what they like, and we see different solutions for the same issue. That's not how we can work toward a sustainable future. For good sustainability, it's needed that we, in the end of the day, make the consumer pay for the product. And there we have to realize our better situation, that we have less carbon footprint and more animal welfare and better biodiversity and all these kinds of things together. So we see we made a big step on animal welfare during the past years with our retailers in the Netherlands, and they are all paying the farmers substantially more money for the meat with a little bit more animal welfare, which is good. And the same parties who were driving this issue during the past 15 years, they are asking us now, okay, then can we do the same for carbon, which is going to happen. That means also that the farmer will get paid for it. And that's where we need to go. We've seen several policies, and the most striking one is, for instance, policy of some Scandinavian countries we've seen, and I don't mean Denmark, where in the beginning of this century they tried to make the agriculture and animal production sustainable, and in the end of the day they are a big net importer and buying a product which is less sustainable than their product was when they started to innovate their legislation. And I don't think this is the way we need to go. So there is a lot of legislation out. I was a little bit flabbergasted 2 years ago when the European Commission said, oh no, we stopped the whole process of PEFCRs. We don't do that for the next years because we are working on other things. Hello guys, I need standardization, I need that taxonomy to be done in a proper way, so that we can compare everything and we can move the issue. So for the Paris Agreement, the government asked me different data than what I need to do for the CSRD data for the supply chain, for my customers. And they're not looking for standardization and getting this thing going. So I'm in favor also of these ETS when we standardize. and then we don't screw up the system, but because then in the end of the day we are calculating over 3 different ways the same carbon footprint. And then you are driving the farmer crazy and we are putting our energy in the wrong direction.
Thank you. We heard you speak earlier on, and I think we got a very clear idea of what your proposal is. But maybe you could comment on the on what has just been presented by your 3 fellow panelists and this option of mix, and comment maybe on what Bert was saying. Fix what exists and don't create anything new. So I'd like to hear your views on these remarks.
Yes, I agree that we need a mix of policies. Carbon pricing is one, but very important is also a change in subsidies towards farmers, and maybe also subsidies towards consumers to help them to pay the right food products with a low climate impact. And on top of that, standards could also help, maybe standards for retail and harmonized benchmarks that I also support, of course, that is needed to avoid administrative burden in the whole food chain. I don't know the solution, but I hear many people say this is important, and the EU Commission also told to work on those sustainability benchmarks. So I hope this will be the right way forward. So yes. I think it will be a mix, but as I told, I believe pricing and rewarding, because ETS is pricing and rewarding, is a very powerful tool, which proved itself in other sectors, and I'm convinced it will also be a very good tool in this sector. It's new, so everybody's a bit afraid and they don't know about it now. But Alex Datema told that he had some hesitations if it would lead to a net input of money into the sector. But I'm really convinced that it works this way. So it worked also in the ETS1. That of course there was much more money put into the energy sector, because of all those subsidies and investments in the sector, because a lot was needed to change, and this will work also in the agriculture sector, and because we all know farmers need money to make next steps. And so food companies can only do so, like Friesland Campino did also, to reward farmers extra. Otherwise, the climate targets will not be made. And this is also what Bert said. So this is how it could work. So I'm convinced it will lead to extra money into the sector and to help farmers. But on top of that, also the cap subsidies, of course, need to be reformed and also give the right incentives to farmers. And on top of that, also national governments can also have tax systems that they increase environmental taxes on specific food products and use those revenues to also support farmers on top of what the EU can do and others. So we need more incentives and instruments, in my opinion.
I'd like to turn to our previous speakers to see if at this stage anybody would like to react either to one of the suggestions that was made or one of the comments that was made by our panelists, particularly about some of the things you said. I don't know, Valeria, if you'd like to maybe add a comment at the stage, or I don't want to put you under pressure. I mean, if you're just listening, you're just listening, and that's absolutely fine. But if anybody has a comment or a question at this stage on this particular aspect of the various mixes that have been proposed and on fixing things. Yes, sir? You're hesitating.
It was a bit beyond, but I have a question.
Hold on, mic is coming. Please tell us your name and the organization.
So, Koen Blomsma for VEDIO, which is the European Association for Oilseed Processing and Vegetable Oil Refining. Yeah, I had a question on issues of measuring, reporting and verification. because that's a bit not so much in the headline until so far. I think before we can really grasp all these options, I think we should also know how realistic they are. But that's, I think further to what Bert said on the need for standardization, and that's what be my question to Mr. Lam, right? I'm following your outputs of your work on a regular basis, and my compliments for the very good work you're producing. It's very informative. But are you also going to pay more attention to measuring, reporting, and verification? So what's the issue? What's the situation on data, right? How granular are they? What's the quality of the data? What's the state of play of modeling all these data? Is there standardization? Is there not? I think that's, for me, still a big gap, right, in trying to weigh all these options.
Thank you. So, Long.
Thanks. Very good question, and I must say, of course, it's not just my own studies and not just Tarnomic studies either. I mean, we have very good partners in IEP and also in the first study, Ecologic, who also contributed a lot more, I would say, to the studies. But when, of course, MRV is very important, and that's why the work from the European Commission on the CRCF is also very important, and we see this as directly connected to enabling such a system. Which also comes back to Bert's comments on standardization, to also ensure that there is standardization. So in the studies that we have done so far, data has been quite difficult to obtain, and even in the study we're currently conducting, data remains an important factor, but quite a complicated issue. So one consideration or it's a way of thinking is also that data must improve. And there are different ways it can improve, but essentially, ultimately, you want to have clear farm-level data. That was let's say, the end goal of MRV, basically. So that's ultimately what you want, and this will not happen by itself. So you can think of different ways to support also farmers in getting this data, whether this is through policy or also through funding, financing, to also improve the MRV. I think these are ways that, say, from my personal perspective, such a direction can go for the policy. So, but at the same time, there is also data on standardized factors. They do not necessarily reflect certain types of on-farm practices, like reducing emissions, changing feedstock or feed practices. It's not really reflected in this data. So that's also where the CRCF could play a powerful role in making these standardized values more tailored to the farm level. But we're not there yet, by far not. I think this will be a process, and the more we can accelerate it, the closer we can get to also achieving our goals in climate and rewarding the farmers that actually contribute to reducing emission reductions.
Thank you. Would anybody else on the panel like to add anything about this? No? Okay, so we have a question from the gentleman over there, and Valeria? Yes. Okay. We'll listen to the next question, and then we have at the back.
That fits perfectly. My name is Kai Schlegelmilch from the German Environment Ministry. I would like to pose a question actually to Valeria from the Commission, because you mentioned nature credits, and I would like to understand better what is the definition of nature credits, how would they work, and what is the relationship to a potential emissions trading system. So I would appreciate having an answer on that, please. Thank you.
Okay, then I take this question, then I had the wine, the Dutch wine. Then I had a comment on what Long said. So that work on nature credits is very, very much in the early stage. It's not DG Clima leading it, it's our colleague from DG Environment. They launched 2 pilot projects, one in France on peat valley wetting and one in Estonia on forest management. So they are looking at ways to quantify this biodiversity or nature benefits. So it's really an exploratory phase, but there are a lot of things going on globally. If one day we introduce the notion of nature credits in European legislation, the CRCF could be a good basis because we already have the verification rules. Bert was mentioning that we don't have clear rules for verifying that the quantification was done well. So under CRCF, we are trying to create also these verification, certification rules to standardize how the data are collected, how they're verified. So that could be a good basis, but the methodology themselves, we are really looking at how it could work. And well, no relation to an ETS because there is no legal proposal on an ETS, but in CRCF, every carbon farming activity, so under the carbon farming certification, every carbon farming activity must have co-benefits for biodiversity, so there is a link to that work stream. And my comment was, we were saying there are no data, but we also heard from the Danish example. There, so what the farmer has to do, they have to provide activity data, so they don't have to quantify anything. They just have to say what they do. Many things, I guess, are standardized, and only if they do something that is better than the average, so only if they do something more that could earn them a lower tax rate, then I guess they have to demonstrate this somehow. But it's probably something that is not so difficult, so information that is not too difficult for them to provide. Because you have to remember, this is not about soil carbon. This is about like how my barn looks like. These are things that you can observe. It's much easier than in the case of soil carbon or in the case of agroforestry. So it's a nice example because the farmer provides the activity data, and then the climate department is in charge of providing the emission factors. So these are the same emission factors used in the national inventories. So this is a very clear link between what the individual farmer does and how the national inventories are computed. So you can see as a policy maker what was the direct impact of your policy on your national statistics, which is something we should go forward. So this benchmarking system is, the data used are the same, and they are the basis for getting incentives from the market, getting reflecting this action in the national inventories, and possibly also allowing the food company downstream to make claims or statistics about their climate transition. So it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And we can start with default approaches for the entire supply chain. And then only in cases in which you want to show that some of my farmers are doing better, then only in these cases you need to go and monitor with a lot of details. You don't have to have a very accurate monitoring of all your supply chain, but only of those farmers who give you the basis for a claim of emission reductions. So, and also as who said, someone said, maybe from Concito, data is a difficulty now, but it won't be forever, because we are seeing so many technologies to bring more data to the forefront. So, yeah, there are ways also to address this data challenge. Actually, no, then I had a question maybe for Kathleen and Bert, as who come from the food sector, whether in your experience with Scope 3 reporting, you are seeing already some developments, some progress in collecting this data more easily or more in a more harmonized way.
So I'll first give the opportunity to Catherine and Bert to answer, and then we have a question from the gentleman at the back.
So it's still one of the challenges, definitely, and progress, I think, little by little. There are also a lot, maybe I'll take the opportunity to mention some more of these projects that would need to scale up by providing incentives such as some kind of pricing scheme, however that could look like, if it would be an ETS or compliance targets or whatever that could be. But companies like our members, we have very encouraging examples, more on a smaller scale, not covering the whole sector. For example, I think it was mentioned before, there's this partnership between Friesland Campina and Mars. We have Mars here in the room today with us. It's about cooperating with dairy cooperatives. So about also adding feed additives, trying other means, lots of different technologies to reduce the emissions, and with the goal by 2030 to actually reduce the emissions from dairy by 50%. Yeah, but so you can do it on a small scale. I could bring you more examples, maybe one example from Cargill, because I also see Emanuele is here with us. There's Cargill Regen Connect. It's